I came home to find my suitcases sitting outside in the rain and the locks already changed. No argument, no warning, just a silent decision that I was no longer welcome unless I handed over the pension I had earned over a lifetime. In that moment, I understood that love had been replaced by calculation, and belonging had a price tag. I stood on the porch, realizing that saying no would cost me my home, but saying yes might cost me myself. What happened next forced me to choose between family and dignity. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Linda Carver, and I am 67 years old. When I look back now, I can see that the turning point in my life did not arrive with shouting or sudden catastrophe. It came quietly, wrapped in the language of family, practicality, and love. At the time, I believed I was stepping into a safer chapter of life, one defined by closeness and shared support. I did not yet understand how fragile that belief would prove to be. I had spent 35 years working as an accountant for the public school system in Arizona. Numbers suited me. They behaved predictably, followed rules, and balanced when treated with care. I lived the same way. I paid my bills on time, avoided debt, and saved steadily. My pension and Social Security were modest, but dependable. They provided the kind of security that allowed me to sleep at night without fear. 3 years before everything changed, my husband died after a long fight with cancer. Grief hollowed out the center of my days, but it did not erase who I was. I learned to live with silence rather than fear it. There is a difference between being alone and being lost, and slowly, I found my footing in that quiet space. I remained in our small home in Mesa, Arizona, a stucco house that held decades of shared routines. Mornings began with coffee and the soft desert light spreading across the yard. I tended to my small cactus garden, trimming dry edges and watering carefully before the sun grew harsh. In the afternoons, I visited the community library or attended a senior book club that met twice a month. Evenings were for reading, light television, and the steady comfort of routine. My life was modest, but it was mine, and it was stable. My daughter Rachel lived in Scottsdale with her husband Derek and their 2 children. Rachel had always been driven, moving through life with an energy I admired but never shared. Derek worked in real estate, and during the housing boom, his success seemed effortless. Their home was larger than anything I had ever needed, filled with motion and noise and the bright clutter of a busy family. When the housing market slowed and interest rates rose, the change came quickly. Derek lost contracts. Mortgage payments increased. Everyday expenses climbed higher. When Rachel called, her voice was controlled but strained. She explained that they were restructuring their finances and needed time to stabilize. She suggested I sell my house and move in with them. It would save money, she said, and allow us to support one another. I would be closer to the grandchildren. The arrangement would be temporary. I hesitated longer than I admitted. My home held the echoes of a marriage and the quiet peace I had fought to rebuild. But I told myself this was practical. Families close ranks when times grow difficult. I chose to believe that helping them would also give me renewed purpose. I packed my belongings into boxes, labeled in careful handwriting. I kept what mattered and left what could be replaced. Selling the house felt less like a loss and more like a transition I had decided to accept with dignity. When I arrived in Scottsdale, Derek carried my suitcase down the hallway to a guest room at the back of the house. The room was clean and neatly arranged, but it carried none of my history. I set my suitcase beside the bed and stood for a moment, listening to unfamiliar sounds moving through the walls. I told myself I was safe. This was family. This was temporary. Yet, as I closed the door behind me that first night, a faint unease brushed past my thoughts, light as desert dust and just as easy to ignore. If you're still watching and you can sense that something beneath the surface isn't quite right, comment number 1 below, so I know you're with me. Now let's move on to Chapter 2. Living in Rachel's house began quietly, as if the walls themselves were trying not to disturb me. I moved through the first weeks with the careful awareness of a guest, stepping lightly across the tile floors and keeping my belongings contained within the boundaries of the spare room at the back of the hallway. I told myself the arrangement was temporary. That belief made everything easier to accept. Temporary spaces do not require ownership. Temporary living does not demand negotiation. Each morning, I woke before the rest of the house. The desert light crept slowly across the kitchen counters, while the air conditioning hummed in the background. I brewed coffee, wiped down the granite surfaces, and set out bowls for the children before the rush of the day began. I learned their routines quickly, which mornings required earlier departures, which afternoons involved sports practice, and which days Rachel worked from home behind a closed office door. I tried to be useful without appearing to take over. Help, I believed, should arrive quietly. The house itself carried a rhythm entirely different from the steady calm I had known in Mesa. The garage door rattled open and closed throughout the day. News played softly from the television. Backpacks thudded against the wall hooks. Even the sunlight felt brighter here, reflecting off glass and pale stone in a way that left no corner in shadow. Derek was home far more often than I had expected. He explained he was between opportunities while waiting for the right deal. He spent long stretches at the kitchen island with his laptop open, phone pressed to his ear, or pacing slowly across the living room while speaking in low, controlled tones. I did not try to listen, yet the energy of calculation and tension filled the space like a low electrical current. Money entered the air gradually, without direct address. Derek spoke about rising property taxes, summer electric bills, and grocery prices that seemed to climb each week. He mentioned insurance premiums and interest rates as if they were unwelcome guests that refused to leave. His voice remained conversational, but the repetition gave the subject weight. Once, while rinsing a mug, he remarked that reliable fixed income was rare in uncertain times. He did not look at me when he said it, yet his gaze shifted briefly in my direction before returning to his screen. Rachel heard these comments too. I watched her react by not reacting. She redirected conversations, checked her phone, or asked the children questions that did not require answers. Her avoidance felt less like disagreement and more like a choice to preserve calm. Small signals accumulated. Envelopes lay open on the kitchen counter with totals visible through the windowed paper. Utility statements remained unfolded beside the fruit bowl. Conversations about expenses occurred within hearing distance, but never included my name. I noticed myself changing in response. I turned off lights the moment I left a room. I shortened my showers. I began buying my own groceries and labeling them on a single shelf in the refrigerator. No one had asked me to do these things. That was what unsettled me most. I told myself I was being considerate. I told myself this was what mothers did when families needed breathing room. Yet beneath those reassurances was a quiet awareness I could not entirely dismiss. My presence was being weighed against cost. Nothing had been said directly. No request had been made. Still, as I lay in the narrow guest bed at night, listening to the air system cycle on and off, I sensed that expectations were forming in the silence. For now, they remained unspoken. If you're starting to notice the subtle warning signs forming inside this home, comment number 2 below to stay with me. Now let's continue to chapter 3. By the third month, the air inside the house felt heavier, though nothing visible had changed. No voices were raised, no doors slammed, and no direct complaints were made. Yet a quiet tension settled into the corners of the rooms and lingered there. I moved carefully through each day, as if one misplaced step might crack something fragile beneath the surface. Derek was home nearly all the time now. He worked from the kitchen island, the dining table, or the living room sofa, shifting locations but never the intensity of his focus. His phone rarely left his hand. He paced while speaking in low tones, paused to type quickly on his laptop, then resumed pacing as though recalculating the same problem from a different angle. The energy around him felt sharp and contained. I began to notice the way his eyes followed me at times. There was no hostility in his expression, but there was no warmth either. It was the look of someone assessing weight and function, as if determining where an object might best be placed to balance a load. That unsettled me more than open dislike would have. The moment itself arrived without warning. I was walking down the hallway toward the kitchen to refill my tea when I heard Derek speaking on the phone. His voice was quieter than usual, controlled in the way people speak when they believe privacy has already been secured. I would have made my presence known if I had realized what I was about to hear, but instead I paused instinctively, held in place by the sound of my own circumstances being discussed. He spoke about rising costs and timing, about the pressure of holding on to the house while waiting for the market to recover. His tone was not frustrated. It was deliberate. He mentioned the need for stability and predictable income. Then he referred to my pension, not my name, not my presence, just the reliability of a monthly payment that could cover gaps and buy time. I stood there longer than I should have, neither frozen nor shocked, simply still. The realization did not strike like a blow. It settled slowly, aligning itself with details I had tried not to examine too closely. This was not a man venting his worries. This was strategy. When he ended the call, I stepped back silently and returned to my room. I closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed, folding my hands in my lap like a child waiting for instruction. I felt cold, though the room was warm. What hurt most was not the money. It was the clarity. Once something is named, it cannot be unnamed. Over the following days, everything rearranged itself in my mind. The comments about expenses, the bills left open on the counter, the glances when I paid for groceries, the way conversations paused when I entered a room. Even Rachel's silence took on new meaning, no longer neutral but complicit in its quiet acceptance. I did not confront him. I did not repeat what I had heard. Instead, I chose silence, telling myself I needed time to observe and understand how long this thinking had existed. For most of my adult life, I had smoothed discomfort rather than challenge it. That instinct now felt less like wisdom and more like exposure. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle around me, the soft hum of the air system, the faint creak of cooling walls, footsteps above me crossing the floor. I thought about how easily a lifetime of careful work could be reduced to a line on someone else's balance sheet. By the end of that week, I understood something I could not unlearn. I was no longer simply staying with my daughter. I was being counted on in a way that stripped me of choice. And once you realize you are being measured for what you provide rather than who you are, silence begins to carry a cost. If you felt the moment when suspicion turned into something far more unsettling, comment number 3 below, so I know you're still here. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. After overhearing Derek's phone call, I told myself the wisest response was patience. I did not confront him, and I did not repeat his words in my mind as accusations. Instead, I chose the strategy that had carried me through most of my adult life. I adjusted. If I made things easier, if I required less and offered more, perhaps the tension that had begun to collect in the house would soften on its own. Silence, I told myself, could still be a form of peace. The next time the electricity bill arrived, I opened it before anyone else could. I wrote a check and left it beneath the envelope on the kitchen counter, positioned neatly where it would be found without discussion. The following week, I paid the internet bill, then the water. I began buying my own groceries and placing them on a single refrigerator shelf, labeled more from habit than necessity. Each small payment felt practical and responsible, yet it also carried a quiet undertone I could not ignore. I was justifying my presence. I filled my days with work no one had assigned. I waited at the bus stop each afternoon to walk the children home. I set out snacks, supervised homework, and listened to stories about classmates and playground disputes. Dinner was ready when Rachel ended her late meetings, timed carefully so that the food was warm but not overcooked. I folded laundry in the evenings and mended loose buttons or small tears that would otherwise be forgotten. The tasks accumulated into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and invisible. At first, Rachel thanked me often. Derek nodded his appreciation. Over time, the gratitude faded. The work remained, but acknowledgement dissolved into the background hum of daily life. What had begun as help slowly became expectation. Derek's requests shifted in tone as well. In the beginning, he framed them as favors, delivered casually and without pressure. Soon they sounded less like questions. He assumed I could pick up the children, stay home for a delivery, or run an errand if his schedule changed. I rarely refused. Refusal felt like friction, and friction felt dangerous in a house already strained by quiet pressure. One afternoon, when the house was unusually still, I asked Rachel if we could talk. I chose my words carefully, explaining that I was happy to help, but uneasy with how often money entered the conversation. She listened with her arms folded, her expression weary rather than defensive. She said Derek was under tremendous stress and that we all needed to be flexible right now. She did not dismiss my feelings, but she did not stand beside them either. I left the conversation feeling smaller than when I entered it. It became clear that my comfort ranked somewhere below preserving calm in her marriage. That realization settled heavily, like dust that refuses to be brushed away. The financial pressure grew less subtle. Bills appeared on the counter in deliberate display. Derek spoke more openly about fairness and contribution, repeating the idea as if repetition alone would transform it into agreement. No demand was made, yet the expectation hovered, patient and persistent. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle, wondering when endurance had become indistinguishable from consent. I had spent decades believing that giving more would be met with care in return. Now I began to see the flaw in that belief. When generosity goes unprotected, it invites consumption. With each compromise, another boundary disappeared. With each boundary erased, the next expectation felt easier to justify. I sensed a decisive moment approaching, one in which the unspoken would finally be spoken aloud. The limit, I knew, was near. If you can feel the pressure building and sense that a breaking point is coming, comment number 4 below to keep watching. Now, let's continue to chapter 5. I sensed something was coming long before Derek spoke. The house carried a stillness that day, the kind that settles before a desert storm. Dinner passed with unusual quiet. The children were sent upstairs earlier than usual, their footsteps fading into the second-floor hallway. Rachel moved through the kitchen with efficient motions, stacking plates, wiping counters, avoiding my eyes. I sat at the table with my hands folded, aware of a tightening in my chest that felt less like fear and more like recognition. Derek waited until the house was silent. Then he set a folder on the table between us. The sound was soft, almost polite, but it landed with weight. He opened it carefully and slid a sheet of paper toward me. The format was immediately familiar. Columns, totals, clean lines designed to look objective and reasonable. He began speaking while I looked at the page. Mortgage, insurance, utilities, groceries, property taxes, maintenance. The structure suggested logic. Numbers carry an authority that discourages argument. Halfway down the page, my name appeared. Next to it was a figure representing what it supposedly cost for me to live there. Beneath that line was a proposed contribution amount. It matched my monthly pension almost exactly. The hours I spent with the children, the meals I prepared, the laundry I folded, the invisible work that filled my days, none of it appeared anywhere on the page. Something inside me went very still. Derek spoke about fairness and shared responsibility. His tone remained calm, measured, almost professional. He explained that expenses had risen sharply and that everyone in the household needed to contribute in a meaningful way. He emphasized predictability, stability, and the importance of planning. I barely heard the individual words. What I noticed instead was Rachel sitting beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her gaze fixed on the table as though the wood grain might offer escape. I waited for her to speak. I waited for any sign that she would interrupt, soften, or question what was being presented. She did not. In that moment, I understood this conversation had already happened without me. I was not being consulted. I was being informed. Derek finished speaking and looked at me expectantly. The refrigerator hummed behind us. A car passed outside, its tires whispering against the pavement. The quiet stretched long enough to feel deliberate. He stated it plainly then. If I wished to continue living in the house, I would need to contribute financially. If I could not, the arrangement would no longer be workable. I did not feel embarrassed, though I might have. What I felt was grief, not for the money, but for the illusion I had been holding. I had believed that love accumulated over a lifetime could not be reduced to a spreadsheet. I had believed being a mother meant being protected, not priced. Arguing line by line would only legitimize the premise. I folded my hands and spoke calmly. I said I would not do it. My pension was not a household fund. It was the result of decades of careful work and discipline, and I would not surrender it to stabilized circumstances I had not created. Derek's expression hardened, almost imperceptibly. He repeated that without financial contribution, staying was not an option. Rachel remained silent. In that silence, the last of my uncertainty dissolved. The room felt smaller, not because of the walls, but because of what had been revealed within them. I realized I was no longer deciding how to help. I was deciding who I was willing to become. After Derek spoke, the silence that settled over the table did not feel empty. It felt complete. I sat very still, aware that something inside me had shifted into clarity. I had expected fear, perhaps anger, but neither arrived. What I felt instead was a narrowing of possibilities, as if the path ahead had resolved into two unmistakable directions. One path required me to stay, to surrender my pension, and to accept whatever new expectations might follow as the price of belonging. The other required me to leave, carrying uncertainty with me, but retaining the small, essential core of dignity that had guided my life. Staying offered shelter, but demanded the slow erosion of self. Leaving promised instability, but preserved who I was. Once I understood the choice in those terms, it no longer felt complicated. I repeated my refusal calmly. I did not explain further. Explanations invite negotiation, and there was nothing left to negotiate. My pension was not discretionary income. It was the result of decades of disciplined work, of evenings spent balancing accounts, and years spent planning for a future I believed would remain my own. I would not transform it into a solution for problems I had not created. Derek watched me as though waiting for hesitation, for a softening that would allow the conversation to shift back in his favor. When none came, he reiterated that the situation was simply practical. Expenses had risen. Contributions were necessary. His tone remained controlled, almost detached, as though we were discussing a contract rather than a home. I turned toward Rachel then. It was not a dramatic movement. I simply looked at my daughter and waited. There are moments in a mother's life when hope rises despite experience, when she believes that love will still choose her. Rachel's eyes met mine for only a second before dropping to the table. She said nothing. That silence answered the question I had not voiced. Something loosened inside my chest. The tension I had been carrying for months released its grip, leaving behind a quiet steadiness. I understood that I did not need to persuade anyone of my worth. I did not need permission to protect myself. Whatever grief lay ahead would be easier to bear than the slow diminishment I had been living. I told them I would be leaving, not that night, but soon. I spoke without anger and without accusation. The decision did not invite debate. No one argued. No one attempted to stop me. The conversation ended not with a resolution, but with a finality that required no further words. I returned to the guest room and closed the door. The space looked smaller than it had the day I arrived, stripped of any illusion of permanence. I opened my suitcase and began to pack. I folded clothes carefully, as if order itself could steady me. I gathered documents, photographs, and the few personal items that held meaning beyond their weight. I left behind what could be replaced and kept what could not. The act of packing slowed my breathing. Each deliberate movement reinforced what I had already chosen. I was not leaving in anger. I was not retreating in defeat. I was walking toward a version of myself that still belonged to me. By the time I closed the suitcase, I knew there would be no turning back. Leaving was not failure. Remaining under those terms would have been self-erasure. The decision had been made quietly, but it was irrevocable. Whatever waited beyond this house would be uncertain, but it would also be honest. For the first time in months, that felt like enough. If you understand how difficult that decision was and what it truly cost, comment number 6 below to stay with me. Now let's move on to chapter 7. I did not sleep that night. I lay fully dressed on top of the covers, listening to the unfamiliar rhythm of the house settling around me. Footsteps crossed the floor above. Pipes shifted within the walls, and the air system hummed at steady intervals. I watched the faint glow from the digital clock change minute by minute, suspended somewhere between disbelief and acceptance. A small part of me held onto the fragile hope that morning might soften what had been said, that Rachel might knock on my door and offer acknowledgement, if not apology. I did not expect reconciliation. I hoped only for recognition. Morning arrived without ceremony. The children were already gone, their backpacks missing from their hooks near the garage door. Derek moved through the kitchen as if the previous evening had never occurred, pouring coffee and scrolling through his phone. Rachel stood at the sink, staring out the window. She did not look at me. She did not speak. The silence felt chosen rather than accidental, a careful avoidance that required effort to maintain. I decided to pick up my prescription from the pharmacy down the street, a practical errand I had delayed long enough. The task felt grounding, something ordinary in a morning that no longer felt ordinary at all. I picked up my purse and keys and paused briefly near the front door, half expecting someone to say my name. No one did. I stepped outside, believing I would return within the hour. The sky had turned gray while I was gone, and a fine rain had begun to fall, soft but steady. As I turned into the driveway, I saw the suitcases first. They were positioned neatly beside the garage door, side by side as if waiting for pickup. For a moment, I remained in the car, unable to process what I was seeing. Rain darkened the fabric, soaking through the seams. I stepped out slowly and walked toward the house. The front door was locked. I knocked once, then again, louder this time. When no one answered, I pressed the doorbell and waited. Through the frosted glass, I saw a shadow pass briefly and disappear. Someone was home. Someone had chosen not to open the door. I stood there longer than I should have, not expecting the outcome to change, but needing to allow the reality of it to settle. This was not anger. It was procedure. My belongings had been removed while I was gone. My presence erased with efficiency. I lifted the suitcases one at a time, feeling the strain in my shoulders as rain soaked through my sleeves. I placed them in the trunk and stood for a moment with my hands resting on the cold metal, looking at the house I had believed was family. As I drove away, fragments of memory surfaced with unsettling clarity. Derek, asking about paperwork. Derek lingering when I logged into my bank account. A file in my room slightly out of place. Questions that had seemed casual now felt deliberate. A realization settled over me with quiet force. Losing my place in that house might have been the smallest risk I faced. I pulled to the side of the road and sat with my hands on the steering wheel, breathing slowly until the shaking in my fingers stopped. Then I called my friend Marlene in Tempe. My voice remained steady. She did not ask questions. She told me to come. By the time I reached the highway, the rain had thinned to a mist. I did not look back again. Whatever grief waited for me could wait. In that moment, distance mattered more than sorrow. Leaving was not abandonment. It was survival. Marlene's house in Tempe greeted me with a quiet I had forgotten was possible. She opened the door before I reached the porch, pulled me into a brief embrace, and took one of my suitcases without asking questions. The spare room was already prepared, the bed made with crisp sheets and a folded blanket at the foot. Nothing about her welcome required explanation. No one watched what I carried inside or asked how long I planned to stay. The absence of scrutiny felt like a kindness I had not realized I needed. That night I slept fully for the first time in weeks. When I woke, the shock had softened into clarity. The heaviness remained, but it no longer pressed against my lungs. I understood that emotion could wait. Practical matters could not. I sat at Marlene's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notepad, organizing my thoughts the way I had organized ledgers for decades. I made columns: banking, legal protections, housing, identity security. Writing the words steadied me. Action would restore order where trust had failed. The bank opened at 9. I arrived early and waited in the parking lot, reviewing my list. Inside, I explained that I needed to review every account connected to my name. The associate guided me through each line patiently. I revoked all secondary access, updated passwords, and replaced my contact information with secure delivery options. We enabled multi-factor verification and removed any link transfers I did not initiate myself. I redirected my pension and Social Security deposits into a newly secured account. Automatic payments were reviewed and limited. Each form I signed felt like a small layer of vulnerability lifting away. The associate asked gently if everything was all right. I answered that I was taking precautions after a change in living arrangements. He nodded without pressing further. I appreciated the restraint. Financial vulnerability often begins with access, not intent. From the bank, I drove to the office of the attorney who had handled my husband's estate. She greeted me with calm familiarity and listened without interruption as I explained the circumstances. We revoked outdated financial authorizations and updated my will. At her suggestion, I established a trust for my grandchildren, structured to protect the funds from misuse. The decision was not punitive, it was protective. She advised documenting the events that led to my departure, not in anger, but in clear, factual detail. I wrote everything down while it remained fresh. The act of recording the sequence restored a sense of order. That afternoon, I toured a modest apartment in a senior-friendly complex not far from Marlene's neighborhood. The space was small, clean, and quiet. Sunlight filtered through the wide blinds onto neutral carpeting. The lease would bear only my name. When the manager placed the keys in my hand, their weight felt disproportionate to their size. I slipped them into my pocket like proof of something reclaimed. By evening, my phone showed missed calls and unread messages. I did not open them. Silence, this time, was not surrender. It was boundary. Sitting alone in my new apartment with only a suitcase and a chair, I felt something settle into place. I had not raised my voice. I had not sought revenge. I had simply taken back responsibility for my own life. Correction, I realized, does not require witnesses. It requires decision. If you can feel the shift from survival to clarity and you're ready to see how this ends, comment number 8 below so we can move into the conclusion of this story. The days following my move into the apartment began to arrange themselves into a quiet rhythm. Each morning I made tea and sat by the window, watching the street below come slowly to life. A man walked his dog at the same hour each day. A delivery truck paused briefly at the corner before moving on. No one asked where I was going or how long I would be gone. The silence in my new space did not feel empty. It felt earned. I slept better than I had in months. Without the constant awareness of being measured against cost, my body seemed to loosen its guarded posture. I moved through the apartment without hesitation, placing a book on the table, hanging a coat by the door, arranging the few belongings I had brought with me. Ownership, I realized, was less about space and more about permission. The messages began that first evening. At first, they were tentative, as if written by someone unsure of the tone they should use. Rachel said she was confused and did not understand why things had escalated so quickly. Derek wrote separately, his language polite, suggesting we should talk things through calmly. I read the messages once and set the phone face down on the table. I did not feel anger. What I felt was distance. For the first time in months, I was not reacting on demand. Silence was no longer surrender. It was a choice. Over the next few days, more messages arrived. The tone shifted in ways that would have been subtle if I had not been listening for them. Certainty gave way to uncertainty. Statements softened into questions. Requests replaced assumptions. The urgency beneath the words felt different now, less confident, more searching. I recognized the shift immediately. Without my pension as a fallback, the structure they had quietly built around my compliance had collapsed. The realization brought no satisfaction. It saddened me more than I expected. I had never wanted leverage over my daughter. I'd only wanted respect. Grief surfaced in unexpected moments. I missed the children's laughter echoing through the house. I missed the casual chaos of family dinners and the comfort of belonging to something larger than myself. I mourned not only what had happened, but the version of our relationship I had believed existed. Yet alongside the grief was relief, deep and steady. I no longer monitored my footsteps, my electricity use, or the length of my showers. I no longer calculated how to take up less space. The relief was not dramatic. It was quiet, like air returning to a room that had been sealed too long. After nearly a week, I sent Rachel a brief reply. I told her I was safe and settled, and that I needed time and space. I did not revisit the past or explain my decision again. Clarity did not require repetition. In the days that followed, I reflected on the ways I had understood motherhood. I had believed endurance was proof of love, and that sacrifice guaranteed care in return. Now I saw that self-protection did not diminish love. It preserved the self that love required. I missed my grandchildren. I missed the simplicity I thought we shared, but I no longer questioned my right to dignity. This was not about winning or losing. It was about alignment. My actions now matched my values. Whatever relationship remained would have to grow from that truth, or not at all. Life is quieter now, but it is a quiet I chose. Each morning begins the same way. I fill the kettle, wait for the soft click as it reaches a boil, and carry my tea to the chair beside the window. The light arrives gently across the parking lot and the small strip of desert landscaping below. A dove lands on the railing most days, pausing long enough to tilt its head before lifting away again. Nothing about these moments is remarkable, yet I feel present in them in a way I had not felt for a long time. There is a difference between solitude and isolation. One is imposed, the other is claimed. What surrounds me now is not absence, but space. Space to move, to think, to exist without being measured. When I look back on what happened, the sharp edge of anger is no longer there. What remains is understanding. I can see how easily love can slide into obligation, how devotion can be mistaken for endless availability. For much of my life, I believed endurance was proof of virtue. I believed that giving more would protect the bonds that mattered most. Instead, giving without boundary made me easier to consume. I do not blame myself for loving my daughter. Love is not the mistake. Silence, when it erases the self, is. I understand now that motherhood does not require surrendering ownership of my life. My pension was never a family resource. It was the result of decades spent balancing accounts, planning carefully, and choosing restraint over impulse. Financial independence is not merely practical, it is a form of personal sovereignty. Love that requires payment is not love. It is leverage. Boundaries once felt harsh to me, like walls built to keep others out. I see them differently now. They are lines that define where I end and another person begins. Without them, even the closest relationships can drift into transaction. With them, dignity has room to stand. There are still moments of sadness. I miss my grandchildren's voices rising in overlapping excitement. I miss the version of my daughter who once leaned into me for comfort instead of convenience. I miss the ease I believed we shared. Grief remains, but it no longer feels like collapse. It feels like evidence of love that was real, even if it was not protected. I have learned that self-protection does not negate compassion. It preserves the self that compassion requires. Many people my age are taught to shrink quietly, to become grateful for whatever space they are allowed to occupy. Yet a lifetime of work, care, and contribution does not dissolve into obligation simply because we grow older. We are allowed to say no. We are allowed to safeguard what we earned. We are allowed to leave situations that diminish us, even when the people involved share our blood. Freedom, I have discovered, rarely arrives with ceremony. It arrives quietly, disguised as a door you lock yourself, a bank account only you control, and the simple certainty that your existence no longer requires justification. It looks like mornings that belong entirely to you, and evenings unmeasured by what you cost. I do not know what the future holds for my relationship with Rachel. Reconciliation, if it comes, will need to be built on respect rather than need. I remain open to that possibility, but I no longer negotiate my worth in exchange for belonging. I am still here. I am still myself. That is not a small thing. In the end, this chapter of my life was not about conflict, but awakening. It was about recognizing the moment when silence stops being peace and becomes a cage, when endurance demanded rather than chosen becomes harm. True peace does not come from being needed at any cost. It comes from standing firmly within one's own worth. And standing here now, in a life shaped by my own decisions, I understand something with complete clarity. I did not lose my home. I found myself. In the quiet aftermath of hardship, clarity often arrives where noise once lived. What begins as loss can become awakening, revealing the difference between love and obligation, generosity and self-erasure, endurance and dignity. True peace does not come from being endlessly needed, but from living in alignment with one's own worth. Boundaries are not walls that separate us from others. They are lines that protect the self so that compassion can exist without sacrifice of identity. When we stop measuring our value by what we provide and begin honoring who we are, freedom takes root in the smallest daily choices: a door we close, a life we direct, a voice that finally says enough. If this story resonated with you, we would love to hear your thoughts. Please share your perspective in the comments and consider following and subscribing so you do not miss future stories about resilience, self-respect, and second chances.